A First Nation clean water pledge sounds good in principle, but the parliamentary budget officer says there's not enough money on the books.
We had our own way long time ago before European contact.
And sharing our Kookums stories every month of the year.
Yeah.
Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. The Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls was under fire today. Chiefs at the Winter Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa passed the resolution to extend the National Inquiry, but it included an amendment that Miriam Buller stepped down. Earlier in the day, Manitoba Keewatin Okimakanak Grand Chief Sheila North Wilson took aim at Buller. Here is some of what the Grand Chief had to say.
How many more stories do you need to hear to change the course of this inquiry? That's one of the big problems is that, you know, we're hearing from them, but they don't feel any more vindicated. They don't feel, it doesn't look like they're getting any healing. They're just being re-victimized. We see them on TV day after day crying. They shouldn't feel hurt. They shouldn't feel re-victimized. They should feel empowered. They should feel that that you're going after what's hurting them. The justice system, the welfare system, the child welfare. Those are the things that you should be focusing on if you're a judge and a legal expert. And I mean, no disrespect to you because you're probably a brilliant human being. But I tell you, you're not a brilliant commissioner for this inquiry.
Harsh criticism. In response, Buller says she and the other commissioners will not step down, and added families and survivors are telling the inquiry how important their work is. Buller says the inquiry is acting on criticisms, including aftercare. A pledge by the Trudeau government to end boil water advisories on First Nations is going to cost an extra $3 billion. The Liberals promised an end to long-term advisories within 5 years in the 2015 throne speech. The parliamentary budget officer, in a report released today, said the government will fall short of its promise under the current funding proposed. The NDP called on the government to get serious.
The overall shortfall is in the nature of about $2.3 billion between now and 2021. And again, a lot of that is in operation and maintenance. And I cannot stress enough what happens in communities where the government builds a plan, cuts the ribbon, walks away, and then as things start to have problems, they blame the community and say it's up to you to fix it. There's not a municipality in this country that doesn't have a proper operations and maintenance budget to ensure the safety of its citizens.
Clean water is really needed in our communities, and there's certainly has an impact on the health of our people, the health of our children, youth, elders, everybody that's in the community. So really detrimental to the health of our people. So.
Of course, we would like to hear what you have to say about this or any other story. Here's how to contact us. Send an email to news@aptn.ca, like our APTN National News Facebook page. Follow us on Twitter @APTN News, or go to our website, aptnnews.ca. Canada's Auditor General says the Yukon has not done enough to respond to climate change. In a report released this week, the auditor says the territory needs to turn their commitment into concrete action. Shirley McLean reports.
It's another balmy day in Whitehorse during the month of December. According to a recent report from Canada's Auditor General, and recent research on climate change shows that temperatures in Yukon have risen at a faster rate than the national level.
Yukon is experiencing significant changes which are affecting its land, wildlife, and people. These changes can damage infrastructure, ecosystems, and traditional ways of life.
Casey Thomas is with the Auditor General's office. She delivered the report this week in Whitehorse. The report says the government of Yukon developed a climate change strategy, an action plan, and 2 progress reports, but it made weak commitments. Thomas examined 4 Yukon government departments from 2006 to 2017. She says even though Yukon has committed to reducing their carbon footprint and adapting to climate change, they're not doing a very good job.
The departments need to turn their commitments into concrete action to successfully adapt to the impacts of climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
The impacts of climate change have been seen. Warmer temperatures mean more snow and rain and flash floods. Lakes and rivers are not freezing, and permafrost thaws wreaking havoc, causing expensive damage to Yukon roads and buildings. The auditor reports makes 4 overarching recommendations for Yukon to improve their approach to climate change. Minister of Environment Pauline Frost says climate change is a priority.
It's an audit of the previous government, but it's also a report card on what we could do better, and I'm really pleased about that. It gives us some benchmarks to work towards.
Last year at this time it was minus 25. It's not odd to have warm days here in the Yukon during the winter, but since 1948 it's been warming up by 5 degrees. Canada's Auditor General is looking at other jurisdictions as well and will release a final report in the spring. Yukon government plans to release their strategy on climate change by 2019. Shirley McLean, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
This is Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall's last day in the provincial legislature, and members from both sides paid tribute.
Every one of us regards Brad as a friend. To him I say thank you, don't be a stranger. To all of us he has been not just a colleague, but also a friend.
Wall gave his own farewell address this afternoon. He has served in the legislature since 1999 and led the Saskatchewan Party to victory in the 2007 provincial election. Wall announced his retirement in August. He'll stay on as Premier and Saskatchewan Party leader until a successor is chosen later next month. An Edmonton-based group of Kookums are sharing traditional knowledge and stories in a unique way. That story and more coming up after the break. Here's a look at Friday's weather forecast, starting with another mild day on the East Coast, +4 in Halifax, +3 in St. John's. Sunny and -7 in Happy Valley Goose Bay, -4 under the sun in Cartwright, -4 in Sept-Îles, -5 in Saguenay, 0 in Montreal, -2 in Windsor, Sarnia, Toronto, Peterborough, and Ottawa, -11 in Wawa, -13 for Kapuskasing. Another cool day in Churchill, sunny and -20, -14 in Island Lake. Snow and -8 for Barons River, -4 with snow in Gimli Harbor. Over to Saskatchewan, +2 under the sun in Swift Current, +1 in Regina and Saskatoon. A sunny high of 0 in Meadow Lake, -13 in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Taiwan has a rich Indigenous heritage with 16 different peoples recognized by the state. While their customs and culture differ greatly from Indigenous peoples in Canada, many of their struggles will sound familiar to people here. APTN's Tom Fenario had the opportunity to go to Taiwan recently. Here's part 1 of a 2-part series, The People of Formosa.
Taiwan is affectionately known as Formosa. Portuguese sailors named it as such in the 16th century when they saw the island. It means beautiful. Smaller than Nova Scotia, it nonetheless is brimming with 23 million inhabitants. The cities here fit the Asian template: pulsing skyscrapers, neon-washed markets, constant movement. Much of the west coast is urbanized from the north to the south. But cross over the ring of mountains that divide the country to where they meet the Pacific coast, and you'll see why they call it Formosa. Here, you'll find a slower pace, as well as many of Taiwan's 500,000 indigenous people.
In Taiwan, it's so much more appealing to live here on the East Coast just because it's not developed yet.
Having spent part of his childhood in the U.S. and Europe, Asan Soro's English skills have landed him a job. He gives tours that explain Amis culture, how they are famous for weaving and fishing, and also how it's been a battle to maintain their heritage.
Our family is called the Wu family, which is an interesting fact because, once the Chinese came in after World War II, we had to get new names, new surnames, And so everybody went in and, had to draw their last name, so we picked Wu.
Sandwiched between Chinese rule in the early 20th century, the Japanese were colonizers here. Relations with them were not any better. So Rose Ami's ancestors once staged a rebellion near this spot.
After the harvest, you always have to give major cuts to the Japanese. So after a lot of, just being mistreated, basically, they were fed up and they just went into the police station and beheaded all the Japanese policemen. And the uprising is called Ma Sao Sao, and Ma Sao Sao in our language means light. And why it has that name is because while we were hiding in the mountains, the Japanese came along and they started burning all the houses and the grain stock.
The chiefs who led the uprising were gruesomely executed. Mao Sao Sao was one of the many indigenous-led battles that took place here in the 20th century. And while there's no doubt that relations with settlers are better today, many issues still remain.
Now everybody who wants to retire and stuff is starting to move here. So that's what's driving the land value up, and also, makes us, and ultimately makes us lose our land.
Further south down the coast, Adigwe is performing a ceremony. Before leading a group through the mountain, he must first speak to his ancestors and ask for protection.
其实还蛮紧张的，因为第一次被头目赋予这样的任务，虽然是一个很简单的一个告知的一个任务，其实感觉自己会身负重任的想要去完成这个任务，所以是紧张又带点兴奋。
Adigwe has learned much about his Piniyu Mayan culture from his elders. He is well versed in wild plants growing in his territory. Lately, he's also discovered a lot about agriculture, but in a bad way. Adigwe says many people in his community make a living renting their land to ethnic Chinese, known here as Han, who then grow crops in a way that is detrimental for the environment.
大概可以分成两种碰到的问题。第一种是水土保持破坏，就是整个生态的破坏，因为姜它必须要去开垦新的地，因为姜要好的价钱一定要种新的地。对，那他去开垦山林的话，势必要把树啊。
Etienne Polush is Amis. He also happens to be the minister of the Council of Indigenous Peoples, the government body that deals with indigenous affairs. At a press conference, he explains that about 7% of Taiwan is considered reserved land for indigenous tribes, but about half of that is privately owned, meaning it can be sold.
In 2015, we have the Parliament have revised the Indigenous Basic Law, which enabled the indigenous communities to be to chase the autonomy of themselves. But this bill is still in drafting.
The ministry, known as CIP for short, hopes to have an indigenous autonomy bill drafted before the end of 2017. This will be the 5th draft of the bill to be brought to legislature in the last 12 years. Even if it does pass, not everyone is convinced that it will work. Masako Makalin, a woman's youth leader in the Piniyuman community of Kasavakan, says drawing up territory isn't going to be easy.
Indigenous people in Taiwan, they will fight against each other, because when we drop the land, there will be some similarity between each other, and they will fight.
Tohima Togal is a Piniyu Mayan journalist and activist. She equates having autonomy to trying to run before you can walk.
But now we are looking at the final goal. Forget that between the final goal, we still have this huge gap between ourselves. It's not about the government or about the other actors or the other stakeholders. It's all about ourselves.
The gap, she says, is the common struggle to keep indigenous languages and culture alive amongst the onslaught of Han culture and people.
People don't want us to think for ourselves. They want us to obey, still until today. So that will be, I think that will be the most difficult thing, that for our people to be confident enough, brave enough to say, I don't need your permission.
The race to preserve indigenous languages and culture here is an urgent one. Tomorrow, APTN News will look at what regular folks and the powers that be are doing to keep indigenous culture strong. So if and when autonomy is achieved, it won't be for naught. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Taiwan.
Beautiful looking land and culture. As Tom mentioned, you can catch part 2 tomorrow. Time for another quick break. But before that, here's the Nation to Nation host Todd Lamoran with a preview of tonight's show from the floor of the Assembly of First Nations gathering in Ottawa.
There was plenty of drama today. MKO Grand Chief Sheila North Wilson called for Inquiry Chief Commissioner Marion Buller's resignation. Later in the day, there was a resolution from the floor. We'll support an extension of the inquiry, but only if Buller is removed. Buller herself said the inquiry will continue while it seeks more time and money from the federal government. But it only has 2 weeks now to submit that request. I'll have more on Nation to Nation. Full interviews with Buller and North Wilson, plus I speak to Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott.
Here's a look at the rest of Friday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny highs of 3 above in Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie. A heat wave in southern Alberta, 14 in Calgary, 9 in Medicine Hat and Lethbridge. Cloudy but mild on the west coast, 12 above in Tofino, 9 in Victoria and Port Hardy. Rain and a high of 9 in Prince Rupert, sunny and +8 in Fort St. John. In Yukon, 6 above for Whitehorse. Over to NWT, +7 in Fort Liard, -9 in Yellowknife. Sunny and -22 for Sax Harbor on Friday, -15 in Fort McPherson. Downright frigid in Nunavut, -24 in Arviat, Whale Cove, Baker Lake, and Chesterfield. Snow and -10 in Clyde River, -23 in Resolute. Welcome back. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls wrapped up its hearings in Thunder Bay this week. 50 families spoke their truths, stories of heartbreak and pain. But as Willow Fiddler reports, communities are getting together to provide the families with a healing tradition.
When Leanna Marshall saw a call out for eagle feathers on Facebook, she reached out to her contacts. The feathers were needed for the 50 families testifying at the inquiry hearings in Thunder Bay.
The response was really big. There was 7 women that connected with me right away.
The idea of giving eagle feathers to family members came from Audrey Siegel, a Musqueam who attended the hearings in Smithers, BC back in September.
When we went to Prince Rupert and walked the Highway of Tears to Smithers to kick off the hearings in there. And we thought, oh, let's just bring some feathers with us, and maybe we could share them with the families that are testifying.
Siegel said the word quickly spread, and soon they started getting feathers from other cities. Thunder Bay was no exception.
There were so many feathers given from this community that we're probably going to leave this community and go to the next and have extra feathers there.
She said the feathers have become an important part of the healing that is taking place at the inquiry hearings.
To have something that is so traditional when so many people are so disconnected from who they are and how we do, they still know the feather, and it means so much to them.
And each feather comes with its own purpose and story.
There was a young man who took apart his regalia and gave the feathers for the families because he recognizes the medicine of the feather.
Marshall said she's proud of Thunder Bay for coming together.
I think having that connection to the next community, whatever and whoever that's going to be, that energy and that love and that healing is going to get passed on. And you feel that across Canada.
Siegel said the feathers have helped families connect with one another.
It's a symbol that we're still here, that we still know who we are, that we still have an inherent right and power that comes through us, and not just because we've suffered, but because we've endured.
Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
A group of grandmothers in Edmonton, also known as Kookums, have put some stories together into a new calendar. They hope it will offer some insight into centuries-old traditions. APTN's Chris Stewart brings us the story.
See this? Elsie Paul is a Cree Métis born in the Wolf Lake Métis settlement. Elder Paul is retired, but is still busy most days. As a president of the Kookums Siwatsum Society, she is busy teaching people about Indigenous traditional values. The Society is an Edmonton-based group of Kookums who share their knowledge. Now she is teamed up with publisher Randall Kabatoff from CircleTeachings.ca to put out a special calendar. A calendar that has women-focused stories from Kookums that go back hundreds of years.
Some of them are, you know, and some of them, the traditional child rearing practices, that's been there we had our own way long time ago before European contact. So nature is our teacher. That's an old traditional parenting, you know, that's been around for thousands of years, you know. So we try and get those kinds of teachings into the calendar.
The 15-month calendar has 15 stories from Indigenous and Métis grandmothers. Each story is told by a Kookum who wanted to pass on a story to the younger generations.
And so even about learning about traditional foods, you know, ceremonies, storytelling, all of that is covered in this, you know, child rearing practices, medicines, art, and all of that, you know. So, and this is a beautiful picture again, Kookums in a circle. How powerful is that?
Executive Director of CircleTeachings.ca, Randall Kabatoff, says the calendar is a great door to getting people interested in Indigenous knowledge.
It's a wonderful door. It's a beautiful door. And we just so much believe in the importance of preserving traditional knowledge, language, and culture. And it's vast. And also, you know, we're in such great realization of the need for it. There are so many people that don't have access to a mushum or a kookum, you know, a grandmother, a grandfather.
This is my great-granddaughter. And I just love this picture because of the fact those teachings are continuing. First I taught my grandchildren, and now my great-grandchildren. You know, that's such an honor.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Great-looking calendar. Now, here's a shot of the Northern Lights dancing overhead in Halilikwe First Nation, taken by APTN's Charlotte Moore Jacobs in the Northwest Territories. If you want to see your picture on APTN National News, email them to share@aptn.ca or use the tag APTN News on Twitter or Instagram. Beautiful shot. That is your APTN National News for this Thursday. For news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. Now, stick around. Nation to Nation with Todd Lamarand is next, coming to you from the floor of the Assembly of First Nations Special Assembly in Ottawa. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.